Chains rattled in the frozen night as the bell of the old church tolled for the new year. Inside, the white masters sang hymns, candles glowing against stained glass. But at the back pew, a slave sat silent, his eyes locked not on heaven, but on the overseer who had whipped him near death. The hymn rose, voices praising God. Then suddenly, a scream tore through the sanctuary. Blood splattered the altar. What happened that night would haunt the plantation forever. The year was 1842, and the winds of winter carried a silence across the Louisiana fields. Frost clung to the bare branches, but the soil beneath remained unforgiving, just as it always had for those chained to the land. Among the hundreds of enslaved men and women bound to the Davenport plantation, one figure moved with quiet endurance. His name was Samuel. Samuel had been born into slavery 27 years earlier, beneath the blistering summer sun of 1815. He had never known freedom, only the endless cycle of sunrise and labor, sunset and exhaustion. The plantation stretched wide, rows of cane and cotton, cabins of rotting wood, and the looming house where the master, Charles Davenport, ruled with cold calculation. Charles was a man who measured worth only in crops harvested, pounds of sugar sold, and bodies broken. But it was not only the master's presence that shadowed the enslaved. The overseer, Richard Hale, was the true face of daily torment. He was tall, broad, with a voice that could split the air like a whip itself. To him, the whip was not a tool of discipline, but a language. He believed fear made fields grow faster, and Samuel had felt that belief carve into his back more times than he could count. The mistress, Eleanor Davenport, was no kinder. Behind her lace gloves and Sunday smiles hid a bitterness that ran deep. She despised her slaves, yet relied on their labor to keep her luxuries, her gowns from New Orleans, her silver set for feasts, her standing among other plantation wives. Her cruelty was often quieter than the overseer's, but it cut just as sharp. A missing spoon, a wrinkled cloth, a late arrival to serve tea could result in a lashing ordered without hesitation. Samuel's mother, Ruth, had once whispered stories of freedom to him when he was a boy. She told him about places north of the Ohio River, where men walked without chains and families lived together without fear of being sold. But Ruth herself never lived to see such freedom. She collapsed one summer in the fields, the overseer's blows having weakened her body beyond recovery. Samuel carried the memory of her final breath like a wound that never closed. By 1842, Samuel had grown into a man of quiet strength. His arms were hardened by years of toil, his back marked by scars, his voice low and careful. But his eyes carried storms. He had learned to bow his head when the master passed, to move swiftly when the overseer barked orders, to appear invisible when the mistress searched for someone to punish. Yet within, he carried a rage that smoldered like embers waiting for wind. The plantation itself was a world of contrasts. The grand house with its tall white columns stood at the center like a throne, while the slave quarters sagged in the mud. At night, the enslaved gathered around faint fires, whispering songs of sorrow and hope. The sound of chains rattling as men shifted in restless sleep was the nightly symphony of the quarters. Still, they clung to fragments of humanity, songs carried from Africa, prayers whispered into the dark, stories told to children about ancestors who once walked free. Samuel's role was in the fields, but he was often pulled into labor at the master's house. His height and strength made him useful when heavy lifting was needed, when wagons of sugar were brought in, or when tables had to be set for the great feast the mistress loved to host. Samuel had carried silver trays while white men feasted, their laughter drowning out the growls of his empty stomach. He had stood silent at the edge of ballrooms while women in gowns danced beneath chandeliers, while his own people huddled in cabins with barely enough to survive. The cruelty of the overseer had a rhythm, whippings in the morning for those who faltered in the rows, humiliation at midday for those too weak to carry full loads, and terror at night for anyone suspected of defiance. Samuel had been chained in the stocks once, left through the night while mosquitoes bit into his flesh, because he dared to pause for breath in the field. That night, staring at the stars through swollen eyes, Samuel thought of his mother's stories. He wondered if heaven could see him, or if even God turned away from the cries of slaves. Yet there were moments, small, fragile moments, where hope flickered. At the quarters, Samuel found kinship among the others. He shared cornbread around the fire, listened to elders sing spirituals, and once, in the secrecy of a church meeting held in the woods, he felt a stirring in his soul. The church was forbidden to slaves unless sanctioned by the master, but they gathered anyway, in the shadow of trees, singing soft hymns that seemed to rise above the chains. It was in those moments that Samuel began to understand something dangerous. Faith could be fuel, but anger could be fire. And fire, once lit, could consume even the strongest chains. But the overseer had his eye on Samuel. Richard Hale despised him not only for his strength but for his silence. Hale preferred slaves who cowered, who trembled when he raised his voice. Samuel's silence was different. It was steady, unbroken, a silence that seemed to defy him. And defiance was something Hale could not tolerate. By December of 1841, the plantation was alive with preparations for the New Year's feast. The mistress wanted everything perfect, the table dressed in white linen, the church pews filled for the service, the plantation glowing with piety for the community to see. Slaves were ordered to polish, scrub, and prepare, while the overseer doubled his cruelty to keep them moving. On one bitter morning, as Samuel labored in the cold fields, Hale struck him across the face for not moving quickly enough. Blood filled Samuel's mouth, and laughter filled Hale's throat. "You think you're strong, boy?" Hale sneered. "I'll break you before this year is done." Samuel said nothing. He simply lowered his gaze, as though submitting. But inside, something shifted. A thought took root, sharp as a blade. Before this year ends, it will not be me who breaks. The whispers of rebellion had long drifted through the quarters, though few dared to act. Slaves who had tried were hanged, their bodies left in trees as warnings. But Samuel's rage was no longer something he could silence. The overseer had taken his mother, his dignity, and now his very breath. And as the year of 1841 bled into 1842, Samuel carried within him a vow, one that would erupt on the night when the church bells rang in the new year. What Samuel planned next would not only defy the overseer, but shake the very heart of the Davenport plantation. The winter of 1842 came colder than most, the frost clinging to the cane fields like brittle glass. For the slaves of Davenport plantation, cold brought no mercy, only cracked hands, numb feet, and the overseer's lash urging them to move faster despite the chill. Richard Hale was relentless. He ruled the fields with fire in his eyes and cruelty in his veins. He took pleasure in suffering, as if each scream confirmed his power. The lash sang through the air daily, its bite carving fresh scars over old ones. The slaves worked with heads bowed, knowing that even the smallest falter could bring down Hale's wrath. Samuel was often singled out. His silence unnerved the overseer, who thrived on breaking men into submission. Hale would sneer at him across the rows, daring him to look up. And when Samuel didn't, Hale struck harder, convinced that pain could carve fear into him. One morning, the ground still crusted with frost, Hale forced Samuel to carry a sack nearly twice the weight of the others. Samuel bent under it, his shoulders trembling, his breath visible in the frigid air. When he stumbled, the lash came down. Once, twice, again. Blood dripped into the snow, red against white, and Hale's voice cut through the silence. "Stand, boy. Stand, or I'll bury you alive in this field." Samuel rose, though his body screamed with pain. He met Hale's eyes only for a moment, long enough for Hale to see something dangerous burning there. Not fear, not surrender, something else. Something that unsettled even him. That night in the quarters, Samuel's back burned as others tended his wounds with ragged cloth and whispered prayers. The firelight flickered across their faces, all etched with exhaustion, all familiar with pain. An elder named Josiah leaned close, his voice low. "You can't let him see your fire, Samuel. That man lives to snuff it out." Samuel said nothing. But inside, the fire only grew. The cruelty did not stop in the fields. Inside the grand house, Mistress Eleanor's demands weighed just as heavy. She delighted in reminding her slaves of their place, ordering Samuel to stand for hours holding trays while her guests feasted, scolding him for imagined mistakes, striking him with her hand when anger flared. At the Christmas feast of 1841, Samuel stood in the dining hall, holding a pitcher of wine while the mistress entertained neighboring families. The table overflowed with roasted meats, pies, and sugared fruits, while Samuel's stomach knotted with hunger. The overseer sat among them, invited as if cruelty itself deserved a seat of honor. Laughter filled the hall, but Samuel's ears only heard the sound of chains clinking as his wrists trembled beneath the pitcher's weight. When the feast ended, scraps were tossed carelessly into the mud, where hungry slaves scrambled for them like animals. Samuel did not move. He only stared at the fire burning in the hearth, imagining another kind of fire, one that would consume the master's house, the mistress's silks, and the overseer's smile. It was during this season that whispers began to stir louder in Samuel's mind. Every lash, every humiliation, every night of hunger sharpened the thought. There must come a day when the chains are broken. But danger shadowed every such thought. The punishment for rebellion was severe. Samuel remembered a young man named Elijah who had once struck back at the overseer. He was captured, chained, and hanged from the old oak at the edge of the fields. His body swayed for days, a warning for all who passed. Yet even that memory did not silence Samuel's rising fury. If anything, it deepened it. The new year approached, and with it came the overseer's worst cruelty yet. Preparations for the church service consumed the plantation. The slaves were forced to scrub pews, polish lanterns, and prepare wood for the fire. Hail stalked them like a wolf, striking anyone who slowed. On one bitter morning, Samuel's friend Josiah collapsed while carrying wood. He was an older man, his body weakened by decades of toil. Hail stormed forward, whip in hand. Samuel stepped instinctively toward Josiah, but Hale's glare froze him. "Get up, old man," Hale barked. Josiah struggled, his hands shaking, his breath shallow. Hale raised the whip high. And in that instant, Samuel felt something surge within him. Rage boiled in his chest, his fists tightening. But he stopped himself. If he moved, if he struck now, Josiah would die, and so would he. The whip cracked down. Josiah screamed. Hale struck again, and again, until the old man's body lay still in the mud. The other slaves bowed their heads, silent in their grief. Samuel stood frozen, his nails digging into his palms, blood trickling from the cuts. In his silence, a vow solidified. The overseer's blood will not go unspilled. The church bells rang on the final night of December. The mistress dressed in silks, the master in fine wool. The overseer, scrubbed and polished for the occasion, walked proudly behind them. The slaves followed in silence, some to serve, some to pray. The old wooden church glowed with candlelight, hymns rising to the rafters. White families filled the front pews, their voices lifted to heaven. Slaves were herded to the back, their voices hushed. Samuel sat among them, his face unreadable, but inside, every word of the hymn twisted like a knife. Joy to the world, the Lord is come. The overseer's laugh from the front pew echoed louder in Samuel's ears than the hymn itself. He thought of his mother's death, of the whip, of Josiah's broken body in the mud. And then, like the tolling of the bell, a thought struck him with clarity. Tonight. It will happen tonight. What Samuel chose to do in that sacred place, under the gaze of the cross, would change everything. The night after Josiah's death, Samuel lay awake in the slave quarters, staring at the wooden beams above him. The wind rattled the shutters, and somewhere outside a dog barked, but his mind was fixed on one image: Richard Hale's whip striking again and again. Each crack echoed in his skull, until it was not Josiah lying in the mud, but Samuel himself, Ruth, and every slave who had ever fallen beneath that lash. For the first time, the idea of revenge no longer felt like a whisper. It felt like a command. By day, Samuel worked with the others, his face blank, his body obedient. But inside, he measured, he studied, he planned. He knew Hale's movements, the way he sat in the front pew of the church, his posture arrogant, his whip never far from his side even during worship. He knew the mistress would sit tall and proud, the master stiff with pride, the congregation distracted by hymns and sermons. Samuel also knew that the overseer would never expect rebellion inside the house of God. The church was the master's sanctuary, a place where white families showed piety while slaves were expected to bow in silence. To Hale, it was the one place he could sit untouchable. But Samuel saw something different. He saw the church not as a sanctuary, but as a stage. A stage where Hale's blood could fall upon the altar, where the sound of hymns would be drowned by screams. He began with small steps. In the days leading to the service, Samuel searched for a weapon. Slaves were forbidden from carrying blades, and even tools were locked away at night. But Samuel had learned to be patient, to notice what others missed. On the afternoon before New Year's Eve, while hauling firewood for the mistress, Samuel spotted a broken piece of iron near the blacksmith's shed. Rusted and jagged, it was useless for work but sharp enough for what he intended. He slipped it beneath his shirt, his heart beat loud in his ears, and carried it back to the quarters. That night, while others prayed softly, Samuel hid in the shadows, sharpening the iron against stone. Each scrape whispered a vengeance, each spark a promise. When at last he held it in his hands, the jagged edge gleamed faintly in the firelight. He wrapped it in cloth and tucked it deep beneath the straw of his bedding. But the plan was not without fear. As Samuel worked in the fields the next morning, his heart pounded with questions. What if they saw him? What if he failed? What if he brought death upon all the slaves? Yet another thought pressed harder. What if he did nothing? Doing nothing meant more Josiahs, more Ruths, more bodies buried beneath unmarked soil. Doing nothing meant Hale lived on, free to slaughter at will. Doing nothing was another kind of death, slow and endless. By the time the sun set on December 31st, Samuel's fear had hardened into resolve. The slaves were ordered into their Sunday best, garments still ragged and thin but cleaner than their field clothes. Samuel wore a plain shirt, his hands rough, his face steady. Beneath the fabric, hidden against his skin, lay the shard of iron. They walked together through the cold night air, the glow of lanterns leading them toward the wooden church. The bell tolled, heavy and solemn, calling masters and slaves alike to worship. Inside, the church smelled of pine boughs and candle wax. The mistress had demanded it decorated for the holiday, wreaths hanging from the walls, candles flickering in brass holders. The white families filled the front, their laughter and greetings bouncing off the wooden beams. At the back, the slaves filed into their place, silent, watchful. Samuel sat among them, his hands resting calmly on his knees. No one knew the storm he carried inside. Only he could hear the pounding of his own heart, the echo of his mother's voice, the crack of Hale's whip in his mind. The service began. The minister spoke of salvation, of mercy, of a new year filled with hope. Hymns rose, voices blending, the sound of organ keys filling the space. Hale sat in the front, his broad shoulders blocking the candlelight, his whip coiled at his side like a serpent resting. He laughed quietly with another man, his voice dripping arrogance even in the house of God. Samuel's jaw tightened. His fingers brushed against the iron beneath his shirt, the cloth rough against his skin. He breathed slowly, every note of the hymn twisting tighter around his chest. The overseer's laughter rang again. Samuel's eyes narrowed. It was in that moment, surrounded by hymns, the cross above the altar glowing in candlelight, that Samuel's decision hardened into something unbreakable. He would not wait another day. He would not carry the weight of Hale's cruelty into another year. The overseer's reign would end not in the fields, not in the shadows, but here, in the very heart of the Master's sanctuary. As the congregation bowed their heads in prayer, Samuel's hand slipped beneath his shirt. His fingers wrapped around the jagged iron, its cold edge biting into his palm. He closed his eyes, not in prayer, but in focus. He remembered Josiah's broken body, his mother's final breath, the countless scars carved into his back. He remembered the hunger, the chains, the laughter of masters at feasts while slaves starved. And then he remembered his vow. When his eyes opened, they burned with something no whip could beat down. This night would not end in silence. The hymn swelled through the wooden rafters of the church. Candles flickered, their light casting long shadows across the pews. The Master's voice joined the chorus, loud and prideful. The mistress sang, her hands folded neatly on her lap. But at the back of the church, among the slaves, Samuel sat silent, his lips unmoving. His hand clenched the hidden shard of iron beneath his shirt. His pulse thundered in his ears. The minister's voice rose above the congregation. Let us begin this new year in peace and in faith. Peace. Samuel's eyes lifted toward the front pew, where Richard Hale sat, whip coiled at his side, head bowed as if in piety. The sight of it, the same whip that had slaughtered Josiah, that had carved his own flesh, that had broken his mother, ignited something uncontrollable. Peace had never been given to the slave. Tonight, peace would not be given to the overseer. The congregation bent their heads. Candles flickered. Silence filled the air, broken only by the whispered words of prayer. And then, a scream! The sound ripped through the church as Samuel surged forward, moving faster than thought, faster than the gasps that rose around him. The iron shard flashed in candlelight as he drove it deep into Richard Hale's neck. Blood spurted across the pews, warm and red, staining the hymnals, splattering across the mistress's silk dress. Hale's eyes widened in shock, his mouth opening as if to shout, but only a choking gurgle escaped. The congregation erupted into chaos. Women shrieked, men leapt to their feet, children cried out. Candles toppled, wax spilling like molten fire. The Master staggered backward, his face pale. God Almighty, he cried, but his words were drowned by screams. Hale's body convulsed as Samuel ripped the iron free and struck again, this time across the overseer's chest. The sound of tearing flesh echoed against the wooden walls. Hale's whip fell uselessly from his grasp, coiling on the floor like a dead serpent. The slaves at the back gasped, frozen in disbelief. Some covered their mouths. Others stared with wide eyes, torn between terror and awe. They had dreamed of this moment, whispered of it in secret, but never dared to believe it could happen. Now it was happening before their eyes. Samuel struck once more, the iron plunging into Hale's heart. The overseer's body jerked, then slumped forward across the pew. His blood soaked the wood, dripping down to the floorboards. The man who had lived by the whip now died by iron, slaughtered in the house of God. For a moment, the church froze. Only the sound of Samuel's ragged breath filled the air. His chest rose and fell, his eyes wild, his arms trembling with the force of what he had done. The iron was slick with blood, warm against his hand. And then the shouting began. "Seize him!" the Master roared, his voice cracking with fear. White men surged forward from the front pews. But Samuel did not run. He turned, his eyes blazing, his voice thunderous for the first time. "No more chains!" he cried, his voice carrying through the church like a bell. The words shook the air, echoing off the rafters, piercing through the screens. For the slaves in the back pews, it was as if the chains on their very souls rattled. A young boy darted forward, grabbing Samuel's arm. Samuel swung, striking with the iron, blood spraying across the aisle. A man lunged, but Samuel shoved him backward into the candles. Flames leapt up, licking the wooden wall, filling the church with smoke. The mistress shrieked, clutching her skirts as the fire spread. The master shouted, pulling her toward the door. The congregation spilled into chaos, bodies shoving, trampling, stumbling as they fled. But Samuel did not flee. He stood tall, Hale's blood dripping from his hands, the fire's glow illuminating his face. His breath came in fierce gasps, but his eyes were steady, unbroken, alive. The slaves at the back moved uncertainly. Some pulled back in fear, terrified of the punishment that would follow. Others watched with awe, as though witnessing a vision. For years, they had whispered of freedom, of revenge, of justice. And now one of their own had done what none had dared. Samuel's voice cut through the smoke. This is the price of the whip. He kicked Hale's lifeless body from the pew. It hit the floor with a sickening thud, blood pooling beneath it. The church filled with firelight and screams. The minister fled, clutching his Bible to his chest. Men shouted for ropes, for guns, for justice. But none dared step too close to Samuel, not with the iron in his hand and the wild blaze in his eyes. The mistress, trembling, turned at the doorway, her voice shrill. He'll be hanged for this. Hanged before dawn. Samuel's gaze locked on hers. And for the first time, Eleanor Davenport, the mistress who had ordered whippings for spilled tea, who had sneered at her slaves like insects, felt fear rise in her throat. She fled into the night, her screams vanishing into the cold. Smoke thickened. Flames spread. The church that had stood as a symbol of control, of piety masking cruelty, now became an inferno of judgment. The pews cracked as fire devoured them. The cross above the altar glowed red with heat, casting a shadow across Hale's dead body. Samuel stood amid it all, unmoving, as though rooted to the ground. The iron slipped from his hand, clattering to the blood-soaked floor. His chest rose and fell, his body trembling, but his spirit unshaken. He turned toward the slaves, his voice hoarse but strong. "They will call me murderer," he said, "but I am no man's slave." The words seared into their hearts like fire, a truth spoken in defiance of chains. Outside, the bell tolled again, announcing the new year. But its sound was drowned by fire and screams. Inside, Samuel raised his arms once more, his voice breaking through the smoke. Let them remember this night. Let them remember, freedom is bought with blood. And with that, the flames consumed the altar, the roof cracking above, sparks raining down. Slaves fled into the night, masters dragged their families away, and Samuel stood alone before the inferno, a figure carved in fire and blood. The overseer was dead. The church was burning, and the night of silence had been broken forever. What happened next would seal Samuel's fate. The Davenport plantation would never forget that night. By dawn, the church was nothing but charred beams and smoking ash. The overseer's body, blackened by fire and torn by Samuel's iron, was dragged out and laid in the dirt for all to see. The mistress wept hysterically, her silk smeared with soot and blood. The master stood pale, humiliated, furious, not only that his overseer was dead, but that it had happened in front of the entire congregation. His power had been broken, exposed. And Samuel? He had not run. When the flames consumed the roof, when the pews collapsed in smoke and sparks, Samuel stepped outside into the cold air. He did not crawl or cower. He walked through the crowd of screaming whites with his back straight, his face unflinching. His shirt was spattered with blood, his hands raw, his eyes blazing like embers. The masters shouted for ropes, for chains, for justice. Men tackled him to the ground, fists slamming into his ribs, boots crushing his back. Samuel did not resist. He lay still, staring up at the winter sky, the stars dimmed by the smoke. Chains were clamped around his wrists and ankles, the iron biting into his flesh. But chains no longer felt heavy to Samuel. Not after what he had done. He was dragged back to the plantation, thrown into the stocks. For hours, men came to spit at him, to curse him, to strike him with fists and boots. The mistress approached, her face twisted with rage. "You'll be hanged at first light," she hissed. "Your body will swing from the oak tree for every slave to see." Samuel only looked at her, his eyes steady, unbroken. His silence was more terrible than words. For once, it was the mistress who turned away, unsettled by what she saw. At dawn, the gallows were prepared. A rope swung gently in the wind, creaking like an omen. The slaves were forced from their quarters to witness it. They gathered in silence, their faces solemn, their hearts heavy. Children clung to their mothers. Elders bowed their heads. The master wanted a lesson burned into them that rebellion meant death, that chains could never be broken. But what he did not know was that the lesson had already been written in blood inside that church. Samuel was brought forward, his hands bound, his feet shackled. His face was bruised, his lips split, but his eyes still burned. The crowd of white families muttered with anger, demanding justice. The slaves, though silent, watched with something else in their gaze, something the master did not recognize, but Samuel did. It was not fear. It was memory. The noose was slipped around his neck. The rope scratched against his skin. The master stepped forward, his voice loud, filled with venom. "This man slaughtered his overseer in the house of God. Let all here see what comes of defiance. Let this be his end." Samuel raised his chin, his voice cutting through the cold morning air. "I am a man," he said. His voice was raw, but it carried across the fields. "Not chains. Not property. A man." The words hung in the air like thunder. For the slaves, they carved themselves into memory. For the masters, they cut deeper than any blade. The trap was pulled. The rope snapped taut. Samuel's body jerked, his breath stolen, his eyes fixed on the sky. His chest heaved once, twice, and then stilled. The master thought the lesson had been taught. The mistress believed the terror had been restored. But in the quarters, in the whispers of night, in the songs sung soft by the fires, Samuel's story lived on. Children grew up hearing of the man who struck down the overseer in the church, who faced death without bowing his head. They whispered his name like a secret prayer, Samuel, the one who did not bend. His defiance became a spark, a warning to masters, and a promise to slaves, that even chains could not silence the fire of a man determined to be free. Years later, long after the Davenport plantation had changed hands, long after the mistress and master were gone, the story remained. In the slave quarters of other plantations, in hushed voices carried from one field to another, people spoke of the night the overseer was slaughtered during the New Year's service of 1842. They spoke of blood on hymnals, of fire devouring the altar, of a man who chose death over chains. And though Samuel's body swung from the oak tree, his spirit had escaped. His death was not silence, it was a cry that echoed far beyond Louisiana, a cry that would ripple through generations until freedom finally came. In the end, Samuel's legacy was not the iron shard he carried, not the fire he ignited, not even the overseer's body left broken in a church. His legacy was the truth he carved into the hearts of those who saw him stand, who heard him speak before the rope claimed him. "I am a man." Even now, nearly 2 centuries later, the story of that night lingers like smoke from a fire long burned. The old church is gone, the plantation fields grown wild, but the memory of Samuel's act survives. It is whispered in history, in hidden pages, in the songs of the enslaved that reached for freedom. A reminder that even in the darkest night, chains can be broken, overseers can fall, and one man's defiance can shake the pillars of power. And as the final hymn faded into screams that night in 1842, Samuel proved a truth the masters never wanted spoken, that no matter the chains, no matter the whips, no matter the gallows, slave could rise. And though his body was hanged, Samuel's fire burned on, proof that even in chains, a man could still choose to stand.